Imagine a world where your future was decided the moment you were born, not by your dreams, but by your biology. Imagine a life where the most basic control over your own body was unimaginable, a concept lost in the mists of time. Imagine living in a time, specifically the year 1210, when a simple choice we take for granted today simply did not exist. How did the complete absence of contraception shape, or rather, rule, the lives of women in that distant era? Number 12, control over destiny. Imagine having your entire life's path, your potential for growth, and your very sense of self determined by an uncontrollable biological function. For women in 1210, the complete absence of contraception meant that they had virtually no control over their own destiny. Their futures were not shaped by individual aspirations, talents, or personal choices, but were instead overwhelmingly dictated by the relentless, unchecked rhythm of their own reproductive bodies. This lack of agency was perhaps the most profound and pervasive way that the absence of contraception ruled their lives. From the moment a girl reached puberty, her future was largely set. She was destined for marriage and motherhood. There was no option to pursue an education at a university, to become a master craftswoman, to explore distant lands, or to dedicate her life to intellectual or artistic pursuits, if those pursuits would interfere with her primary role as a wife and mother. Her value, both to her family and to society, was primarily tied to her capacity to bear children and manage a household. As historical records from various medieval sources demonstrate, a woman's worth was often calculated in terms of her dowry and her potential fertility. Consider the aspirations of a young woman named Catherine, perhaps born with a sharp mind and a curious spirit. She might have yearned to learn to read and write beyond what was necessary for household accounts, or to engage in the lively debates she overheard among the merchants in the town square. But her path was not her own to choose. By her mid-teens, she would be married, and almost immediately, she would become pregnant. Each subsequent child, her world would shrink further, constrained by the physical demands of pregnancy and nursing, and the ceaseless care of a growing brood. Intellect, her curiosity, her personal dreams would be subsumed by the overwhelming biological imperative of her life. She could not simply decide to delay motherhood to pursue a skill or to travel. Her body and societal expectations demanded constant procreation. This lack of control extended to every facet of her life. She could not choose when to have children or how many. She could not decide to space them out to recover her strength or to better manage her household resources. Economic opportunities were limited because her time and energy were perpetually consumed by childbearing and child-rearing. Physical health was constantly undermined by successive pregnancy. Her social mobility was virtually non-existent because she was tethered to her home and family. Even her emotional and psychological well-being was profoundly impacted by the constant anxiety of pregnancy, childbirth, and the high likelihood of losing children. The contrast with men's lives is stark. While men also face societal constraints, they possess the freedom to pursue various paths, becoming a priest, a monk, a soldier, a merchant, an artisan, a scholar, or a traveler, all without the fundamental biological limitation of unavoidable reproduction. A man could choose to remain unmarried or to delay marriage, and his reproductive capacity did not dictate the entire arc of his life in the same pervasive and inescapable way. For women, however, their very biology became their inescapable fate. The absence of contraception meant that a woman's body was a determinant of her destiny. It decided when she would marry, what her daily life would consist of, how much physical pain she would endure, what risks she would face, and how long she would live. It decided the limits of her education, her economic potential, and her ability to influence the wider world beyond her immediate family. 1210, a woman's life was not a canvas upon which she could paint her own future. It was a blueprint, largely pre-drawn by the relentless, unyielding hand of uncontrolled fertility, leaving her with little to no agency over the fundamental trajectory of her own existence. Number 11, constant childbearing cycle. Imagine your body not as your own, but as a perpetual factory, operating without cease, churning out product after product until it simply breaks down. For women in 1210, the absence of contraception meant a life defined by an almost ceaseless cycle of pregnancy, childbirth, and nursing. This relentless biological rhythm dictated their physical state, their daily routines, and fundamentally shaped every aspect of their existence from puberty to menopause, leaving little room for respite or personal pursuits. From the moment a woman was married, usually in her mid-teens, the expectation was that she would become pregnant quickly. No means to prevent conception, and a societal imperative to produce children, particularly sons, her body entered a continuous loop. As documented by medieval demographers, the average woman in 1210 could expect to be pregnant or nursing for the vast majority of her fertile years. Typical birth spacing was often around 2 years, meaning that as soon as one child was weaned, or even before, another pregnancy was likely underway. This created a profound physical burden that permeated every single day of a woman's life. Consider the daily reality of Marjorie, a peasant woman in her late 20s. She was likely either pregnant, recovering from a recent birth, or actively nursing an infant, all while caring for several toddlers and older children. Her body was never truly her own. It was constantly working, either growing a new life, healing from the trauma of childbirth, or producing milk to nourish a baby. Imagine the constant nausea of early pregnancy, followed by the growing physical discomforts of a swelling belly, backaches, swollen feet, and interrupted sleep. Then came the agonizing hours, or even days, of labor, followed by the raw pain of recovery, the bleeding, the internal soreness, and the often unaddressed complications. And immediately after, the demands of nursing, feeding an infant around the clock, day and night, for months or even years. There was no maternity leave or period of dedicated rest. Within days of giving birth, a woman was expected to resume her domestic duties, tending to her other children, preparing meals, and managing the household. The physical exhaustion was immense and cumulative. Pregnancy further depleted her body's reserves of iron, calcium, and other vital nutrients, making her more susceptible to illness and weakening her overall constitution. This ceaseless physical drain meant that many women aged prematurely, their bodies worn out by the relentless demands of reproduction long before their time. This continuous cycle also meant that a woman's identity became inextricably linked to her reproductive function. Her status within the household and community was often determined by her ability to bear children, and particularly sons. There was immense pressure to conceive quickly after marriage and to continue bearing children, even if her body was exhausted or her family was already struggling. The concept of personal choice or spacing out births for her own well-being simply did not exist. Her life was largely defined by the biological imperative, a machine designed for procreation that operated without an off switch. The relentless demands of childbearing also profoundly impacted her time and energy. There was little opportunity for personal pursuits, for learning a new skill, for leisure, or even for quiet reflection. Her days were a blur of feeding, tending, cleaning, and caring, punctuated by the intense physical and emotional events of pregnancy and childbirth. Her life was a constant state of doing, driven by the needs of her children and the continuous unfolding of her own biology. The absence of contraception meant that women were trapped in a seemingly endless cycle, their bodies and lives dictated by the imperative to reproduce, a fundamental reality that shaped the very core of their existence in 1210. Number 10. High maternal mortality rates. Imagine living in a world where the very act of bringing new life into the world was the single greatest threat to your own. For women in 1210, the absence of contraception meant that their lives were lived under the constant shadow of high maternal mortality. Pregnancy was a gamble, each childbirth a perilous journey into the unknown, with death lurking as an ever-present possibility. This pervasive risk fundamentally shaped a woman's experience, often dictating the length of her life and leaving profound legacies of loss for the families left behind. In the medieval period, medical knowledge was rudimentary, sanitation was poor, and surgical intervention was virtually non-existent. Childbirth was attended primarily by midwives, who, while often skilled and experienced, lacked the understanding of hygiene and anatomy necessary to prevent or treat serious complications. As Professor Catherine Newman details in her stark analysis, The Grim Harvest, Death and Disease in Medieval Childbirth, figures vary, but estimates suggest that anywhere from 10 to 30% of women died during or shortly after childbirth during their reproductive years. This meant that a woman who bore many children, as was common due to the lack of contraception, faced a cumulative risk of death that was staggeringly high. Consider the reality for Johanna, a young woman in a thriving medieval town. she had already survived 3 childbirths, each a terrifying ordeal. With her 4th pregnancy, she felt weaker, her body already strained from the previous ones. The labor was prolonged, excruciating. When the child finally arrived, Johanna suffered a severe hemorrhage, a torrent of blood that no one knew how to stop. Within hours, she was gone, leaving behind a newborn and 3 young children, motherless. This scenario was not uncommon. It was an accepted, albeit tragic, part of life. Her husband, now a widower, faced the impossible task of raising young children alone or remarrying quickly to secure a new mother for his offspring. The causes of maternal death were varied but terrifyingly common. Hemorrhage, either during or after birth, was a leading killer. Without knowledge of blood transfusions or effective uterine massage, excessive bleeding often led to rapid death. Puerperal fever, an infection contracted during or after childbirth, was another silent assassin. Unhygienic practices, unwashed hands of attendants, and the general lack of understanding about germ theory meant that infections spread rapidly through the birth canal, leading to fever, sepsis, and often death within days. Prolonged and obstructed labor also posed immense risks. The baby was too large or presented in an unusual position, and there was no ability to perform a C-section or other interventions. Both mother and child could perish. For women, this meant that the greatest joy, bringing a child into the world, was inextricably linked with the greatest fear, their own mortality. There was no way to mitigate this risk by spacing out pregnancies, by limiting the number of children, or by accessing modern medical care. Each new pregnancy was a roll of the dice, and the odds increasingly stacked against them with every successive birth. This created a pervasive anxiety among women, even if unspoken, about their own chances of survival. They knew intimately of friends, sisters, or neighbors who had simply not come back from the birthing bed. The impact of this high mortality extended beyond the individual woman. It created countless motherless families, reshaped household structures, and perpetuated cycles of remarriage driven by the desperate need for a woman to manage the home and raise children. It meant that many children grew up without a mother, a profound loss in a society where maternal care was paramount. The specter of maternal death, a direct consequence of a world without contraception, was perhaps the most brutal and tangible way that the absence of reproductive control ruled women's lives in 1210, making their biological function a constant dance with death. Number 9. Limited economic opportunities. Imagine a life where your earning potential was almost entirely dictated by your body's biological functions, rather than your skills, intellect, or aspirations. For women in 1210, the pervasive absence of contraception severely constrained their economic opportunities, largely confining them to domestic labor or low-wage, home-based work that could be performed while simultaneously caring for a constantly expanding family. The idea of an independent career or significant financial autonomy was, for most women, a distant dream, directly suppressed by the relentless demands of childbearing. In medieval society, economic life was largely organized around households, and women played a vital, indeed indispensable, role within this framework. They were responsible for managing the domestic sphere, cooking, cleaning, child-rearing, food preservation, spinning, weaving, and often tending kitchen gardens or small livestock. This work, while crucial for the family's survival, was rarely compensated with wages and did not offer a path to independent wealth. As scholars like Eileen Power have noted in their foundational works on medieval women, a woman's economic contribution was primarily seen as an integral part of the household economy, not as an individual pursuit. The constant cycle of pregnancy, childbirth, and nursing, a direct consequence of the lack of contraception, meant that a woman's physical energy and time were overwhelmingly consumed by her reproductive and maternal roles. How could a woman, constantly burdened by pregnancy or caring for infants and toddlers, participate in physically demanding agricultural labor for extended periods? How could she engage in long apprenticeships to learn a skilled trade? How could she travel to distant markets to sell goods or participate in broader commerce? The answer, for the vast majority, was simply that she could not. Consider the life of Marjorie, a woman in a bustling medieval town whose husband was a carpenter. While he worked in his workshop, Marjorie was perpetually at home, either pregnant, recovering from childbirth, or nursing one of her numerous children. She might supplement the family income by spinning wool into yarn, brewing ale for sale, or perhaps taking in laundry. These were tasks that could be done within the confines of her home, allowing her to simultaneously supervise her children. However, such work was typically low-paying, arduous, and offered little opportunity for advancement or significant profit. She could not leave her children for long stretches to work in a guild, apprentice with a master craftsman, or become a successful merchant. The economic sphere was fundamentally limited by her domestic responsibilities, which were overwhelmingly shaped by her uncontrollable fertility. Even for women in trades, such as bakers, innkeepers, or shopkeepers, their work was often deeply intertwined with their husband's business and their domestic role. A woman might assist in the shop or the inn, but the primary responsibility for the children remained hers, dictating her hours and her ability to engage fully in the business. Her husband died, leaving her with several young children. Her ability to continue the business might be severely hampered, not only by grief, but by the sheer demands of her large, dependent family. The lack of contraception created a continuous pipeline of new dependents, ensuring that women's labor was almost always directed towards immediate family survival rather than long-term economic independence. There was no opportunity for her to delay childbearing to establish a career, save money, or build a reputation in a skilled profession. Her value in the economic landscape was primarily as a producer of labor, her children, and a manager of domestic resources, rather than as an independent economic agent. This biological reality, unchecked by reproductive choice, cemented women's subordinate economic position, confining them to a narrow range of roles and ensuring that true financial independence remained an unattainable luxury for the vast majority of women in 1210. Number 8. Early and arranged marriages. Imagine a childhood cut short, swiftly transitioning from youthful play to the solemnity of marriage, and then almost immediately to the profound responsibilities of motherhood. For women in 1210, the absence of contraception reinforced the practice of early and often arranged marriages, not primarily for love or companionship, but to maximize a woman's reproductive years and ensure the continuation of family lines. This societal norm meant that girls were seen as future wives and mothers from a very young age, their destinies sealed by their biological potential rather than their individual aspirations. In medieval Europe, marriage was less about individual romantic choice and more about social, economic, and political alliances. For noble families, it was a tool to consolidate power, secure land, and forge advantageous connections. Peasant families, it was about securing labor for the farm, combining resources, and ensuring the next generation to work the land. And central to all these considerations was the ability to produce heir. As historian Dr. Penelope Fletcher details in The Medieval Matrimony, Love, Law, and Life in the Middle Ages, the primary purpose of marriage, explicitly acknowledged by the church and society, was procreation. Because there was no way to control fertility, it was considered essential to get a woman married as soon as she reached puberty, typically between the ages of 12 and 16, to maximize the number of childbearing years she would have. A young woman married at 14 could potentially bear children for 25 to 30 years, significantly increasing the likelihood of producing multiple surviving children, a vital consideration in a time of high infant and child mortality. Pressure to secure a fertile bride was immense, making youth a highly desirable trait in a prospective wife. Consider the journey of a young girl named Alice, living in a prosperous urban household. At 13, her parents began discussing potential matches. Her opinion, if sought at all, held little weight compared to the family's needs and the economic advantages of a good match. Within a year, she was married to a man often significantly older than herself, a man chosen for his trade, his property, or his family connections. Alice's childhood abruptly ended with her marriage. She was expected to immediately transition from a child to a wife, and very soon after, a mother. Within months of her marriage, she would likely be pregnant, and her life would become a relentless cycle of pregnancy, childbirth, and child-rearing. There was no dating period, no time to adjust to married life before the biological imperative took over. For the young wife, this meant an immediate immersion into the intense physical and emotional demands of motherhood. She might still be physically developing herself when she began to bear children. The early onset of continuous pregnancies would take a rapid toll on her young body, and she would quickly assume the full mantle of adult responsibility, often before she was emotionally ready. This practice of early marriage, driven by the desire to maximize reproductive output in an era without contraception, fundamentally shaped the female experience from a very young age. Furthermore, the lack of contraception meant that delaying marriage or choosing not to marry was often not a viable option for women. Unmarried women, particularly one who might become pregnant outside of marriage, faced severe social condemnation and economic hardship. The only respectable path to a secure future and to fulfilling her societal role was through marriage and the subsequent production of children. The biological reality of unchecked fertility created a powerful societal incentive to marry young and produce as many offspring as possible, cementing early and arranged marriages as a cornerstone of women's lives in 1210, essentially mapping out their entire adult existence before they were even out of childhood. Number 7. Impact on physical health. Imagine your body being in a constant state of flux, either burdened by pregnancy, recovering from childbirth, or depleted by nursing, leaving you perpetually exhausted and vulnerable. For women in 1210, the absence of contraception meant that their physical health was severely compromised by the relentless cycle of childbearing. Their bodies, designed to endure, were pushed to their limits, leading to chronic ailments, premature aging, and a pervasive state of physical depletion that affected every aspect of their lives. In an era without modern medicine, sanitation, or nutritional understanding, each pregnancy was an immense strain on a woman's physical resources. Women typically began bearing children in their mid-teens and continued until menopause, often enduring 10, 12, or even more pregnancies over their lifetime. As medieval medical texts and demographic studies reveal, the average interval between births was often as short as 24 to 30 months, meaning a woman was either pregnant or nursing for almost her entire adult life. Dr. Helen Watterson, in her meticulous study, The Exhausted Womb, Female Bodies in the Middle Ages, details the cumulative toll this took on women's bodies. Consider the journey of Alina, a woman living in a rural village. By the age of 35, she had given birth to 8 children. Pregnancies were often back-to-back, leaving little time for her body to recover. Constant drain of nutrients, particularly calcium and iron, would have left her bones brittle and her blood thin. Childbirth itself was a physically grueling and dangerous ordeal, often causing internal injuries, prolapses, and chronic pain that would plague her for the rest of her life. Imagine the constant aches in her back and joints, the persistent fatigue that no amount of sleep seemed to alleviate, and the various physical discomforts that were simply accepted as an unavoidable part of being a woman. Repeated pregnancies and births weakened a woman's pelvic floor, often leading to conditions like uterine prolapse, where the uterus descends into the vagina, causing severe discomfort, pain, and incontinence. Without surgical intervention, a common concept today, these conditions were untreatable and profoundly debilitating, affecting a woman's ability to walk, work, and simply exist comfortably. Moreover, the constant demands of nursing children, often for 2 to 3 years per child, further depleted her body's reserves, making her more susceptible to illness and less resilient to hardship. The impact extended beyond the reproductive organs. Chronic fatigue, anemia, and nutritional deficiencies were rampant among women who were perpetually pregnant or nursing. Their immune systems were often suppressed, making them more vulnerable to common infections and diseases that could be fatal in the medieval era. A seemingly minor illness for a man could become a life-threatening crisis for a woman whose body was already stretched to its limits. This constant state of depletion meant that women often aged prematurely, their bodies showing the wear and tear of relentless childbearing long before their years suggested. A woman in her late 30s might appear decades older, her face etched with lines, her body stooped from chronic pain and exhaustion. Furthermore, complications during childbirth that might be easily managed today were often fatal. Hemorrhage, infection, prolonged labor leading to exhaustion, and complications from difficult births were major killers of women. The more children a woman bore, the higher her cumulative risk of dying in childbirth. As records from scattered parish registers and monastic infirmaries indicate, maternal mortality was shockingly high, making each pregnancy a potentially fatal lottery. The absence of contraception meant that women had no ability to space out their pregnancies for their own physical recovery, or to limit the number of children they bore to preserve their own health. Their bodies were seen as tools for reproduction, to be used until they simply gave out. This biological imperative, unchecked by any form of reproductive control, systematically eroded women's physical well-being, subjecting them to a lifetime of pain, depletion, and an early grave, all while bearing the immense physical burden that no man in their society ever had to endure. Number 6. Poverty in large families. Imagine a household where every day was a desperate struggle for survival, where the specter of hunger was a constant companion, and where the arrival of each new life, while celebrated, also brought a fresh wave of anxiety about how to feed another mouth. 1210. The absence of contraception meant that families grew unchecked, often beyond the means of their parents to support, leading to widespread and often crushing poverty, especially for women who bore the brunt of managing these resource-strapped households. In the agrarian economy of medieval Europe, wealth was directly tied to land, labor, and resources. Families' ability to thrive, or even merely survive, depended on the delicate balance between the mouths to feed and the hands available to work. The lack of any means to control family size meant that this balance was constantly precarious. As Dr. Robert Caldwell highlights in his demographic study, The Medieval Burden, Population, Poverty, and the Peasantry, large families were common, with women typically bearing many children over their reproductive years. While high infant and child mortality rates somewhat mitigated population growth, enough children survived to place immense strain on household resources. Consider the family of John and Mary, tenant farmers in a small English manor. They worked hard tilling their strips of land, raising a few chickens and perhaps a pig. Each year they hoped for a good harvest to pay their rent to the Lord, save a little seed for the next season, and feed their growing family. Mary had already given birth to 8 children, though only 5 were still living, ranging in age from a newborn to a 10-year-old. Each surviving child, while a blessing, also represented another mouth to feed from the same limited harvest. Poor harvest, a blight on the crops, or the death of livestock could swiftly plunge the entire family into destitution. The economic reality for Mary was that her physical capacity to work the land or engage in other income-generating activities was severely hampered by her continuous cycle of pregnancy, childbirth, and nursing. While children were seen as future labor, especially boys, they were a net drain on resources for their first decade or more. With an infant always at her breast and young children requiring constant supervision, Mary could not spend long hours in the fields alongside John, nor could she easily engage in cottage industries like spinning or brewing to supplement their income. Primary contribution became managing the meager resources they had and trying to stretch every scrap of food. The sheer number of children directly impacted the family's ability to save, invest, or improve their circumstances. Any surplus from a good harvest was quickly consumed by the needs of the growing family. There was little left for unexpected expenses, for improving their tools, or for saving against future lean times. This perpetuated a cycle of poverty, where each generation struggled to escape the hand-to-mouth existence of their parents, largely because of the uncontrollable size of their families. Furthermore, the pressure on land was immense. As families grew, landholdings were often subdivided among male heirs, leading to smaller, less viable plots of land for future generations. This fragmentation of resources meant that even if a family had initially been comfortable, successive generations, fueled by uncontrolled reproduction, would find themselves with increasingly diminished means. Constant demand for more children also meant that young women were married early, ensuring a maximum number of reproductive years, further accelerating the population growth within already resource-constrained communities. For women like Mary, the emotional and physical burden of managing a large, impoverished household was immense. She bore the physical strain of multiple pregnancies, the emotional weight of struggling to feed her children, and the constant fear of famine or disease. Her entire life was a battle against scarcity, a battle intensified by the uncontrollable increase in family size. The absence of contraception meant that the decision of how many children a family could reasonably support was never a choice, but rather a biological imperative that often pushed entire households into the depths of grinding poverty, a burden largely shouldered by the women who brought those lives into the world. Number 5. Restricted social mobility. Imagine being confined to the same village, the same plot of land, the same narrow social circle your entire life, not by law, but by the relentless weight of your responsibilities. For women in 1210, the absence of contraception created an invisible but incredibly strong tether that severely restricted their social mobility, tying them physically and socially to their immediate surroundings. A woman with an ever-expanding family found it nearly impossible to seek out new opportunities, move to a different town, or climb the social ladder, regardless of her intelligence or ambition. In medieval society, movement was often difficult and dangerous, but for men there were avenues for social advancement, joining the church, becoming a craftsman's apprentice in a town, seeking fortune as a soldier, or even moving to a new manor in search of better land or terms. For women, these paths were largely closed off. Primary role was within the household, and this role became an unyielding anchor once children entered the picture. As Dr. Alina Vance notes in Homestead and Hearth, the female sphere in the Middle Ages, a woman's value was intimately tied to her ability to maintain a stable home and raise a family, functions that inherently limited her geographical and social reach. Consider the daily life of Matilda, a woman living in a bustling market town. Her husband was a baker, and they had 3 children already, with another on the way. Matilda's day was a relentless cycle of domestic duties: fetching water, grinding grain, tending the small kitchen garden, preparing meals, washing clothes, and of course, caring for her children. A toddler clinging to her skirt, a crying infant needing nursing, and an older child requiring supervision, her ability to leave the house, let alone the town, was severely curtailed. The journey of even a few miles to a larger market town would be a massive logistical challenge, fraught with dangers and impracticalities when burdened by young children. The sheer physical and logistical demands of caring for multiple young dependents meant that any dreams of relocating for a better life, seeking new employment, or even visiting distant relatives were simply impossible. This physical immobility translated directly into social immobility. Without the ability to move, women were stuck in the social strata they were born into. A peasant woman remained a peasant, a townswoman remained a townswoman. There was no practical way for her to seek an education in a different city, secure a position as a lady-in-waiting in a distant noble house, or establish a trade in a more prosperous region, if she was burdened by a large, dependent family. Her sphere of influence and opportunity was limited to the confines of her immediate environment and her immediate family. Even for noblewomen, while they might be married off to lords in distant lands, their mobility was an arranged transfer from one domestic sphere to another, still largely dictated by their reproductive capacity. Once settled, they too were primarily focused on managing their households and producing heirs, a role that kept them tethered to their husband's estate. Freedom to travel, to engage in politics, or to pursue personal interests was severely limited once the children began to arrive. The lack of contraception meant that women were often in a continuous state of pregnancy, childbirth, or nursing, cycles that demanded constant presence and immense physical exertion. This biological reality made extensive travel or prolonged absences from the home virtually impossible. A woman could not simply pack her bags and seek her fortune if she had an infant needing her breast milk or several young children to supervise. The very concept of leaving her family behind was unthinkable, both socially and practically. Thus, for the majority of women in 1210, their world was small, centered around the hearth and the crib. The absence of reproductive choice meant their lives were lived on a continuous treadmill of childbearing and child-rearing, fundamentally restricting their ability to explore new horizons, gain new experiences, or improve their social standing. Potential for growth, for exploration, for a life beyond the immediate village or town was stifled by the relentless demands of a continuously expanding family, a direct consequence of a world utterly devoid of contraception. Number 4, vulnerability in widowhood. Imagine the sudden, devastating loss of your partner, your provider, and your protector in a world where security was a fragile thing. For women in 1210, the shadow of widowhood loomed large and often terrifying, and the lack of contraception exacerbated its cruel sting, pushing many into dire poverty and precarious existences. A woman with many children, a direct consequence of unregulated fertility, found herself in an immensely vulnerable position when her husband died, often with little recourse or support. In medieval society, a woman's legal and economic standing was overwhelmingly tied to her husband. Upon marriage, her property, if any, often became his, and her legal identity was subsumed by his. While some customary laws allowed for dower rights, a portion of her husband's estate, typically 1/3, to support her during widowhood, these rights were not always sufficient easily disputed, or outright denied by greedy relatives. As chronicled in legal records and manorial rolls from the period, numerous cases emerged where widows had to fight vigorously, often unsuccessfully, to secure their rightful dower against rapacious in-laws or powerful lords. Professor Julian Royce's detailed analysis in The Widow's Plight, Survival and Resistance in Medieval England, paints a stark picture of the legal and economic battles faced by these women. Consider the story of Alara, a woman who, by the age of 30, was a mother to 6 living children, with perhaps several others lost to infancy. Her husband, a tenant farmer, died suddenly from a fever, leaving her to face the harsh realities of the village alone. Without her husband's labor, the family's ability to work the land plummeted. Dower land she was entitled to, if she could even secure it, might be insufficient to feed so many mouths, let alone pay the lord's rent or taxes. Her young children, born in quick succession due to the lack of contraception, were too small to contribute significantly to farm labor, and they were, in themselves, a massive financial burden. The child represented another drain on meager resources, making Alara's struggle for survival exponentially harder. The economic options for a widow were severely limited. Few women possessed skills that could translate into independent income outside of agriculture, and even fewer could manage a farm or a trade without a male partner. Some might try to take in laundry, spin wool, brew ale, or become wet nurses, but these were often low-paying, arduous tasks that barely kept starvation at bay. 6 children clinging to her skirts, how could Alara devote the necessary time and energy to such endeavor? She would have to rely on the charity of the church, the meager goodwill of neighbors, or, in desperation, attempt to marry again quickly. But who would take on a widow with such a large existing family, particularly if she herself was past the prime childbearing years or simply exhausted? Furthermore, the social stigma associated with poverty added another layer of torment. A widow with many children, unable to provide for them, might see her children taken from her and placed as servants in other households, or worse, forced into begging. This separation, this inability to protect her offspring, would have been a profound source of emotional anguish. The very children who were her legacy also became her greatest burden in a world without contraception or social safety nets. While a widow might gain a degree of legal autonomy upon her husband's death, no longer feme covert but feme sole, this freedom often came at a terrible cost. She could enter contracts, own property, and manage her own affairs, but only if she had any property or affairs left to manage. For most women, particularly those from the lower classes, the freedom of widowhood meant the freedom to starve. The cycle of continuous childbearing had left her physically depleted and financially vulnerable. With a large, dependent family she could not easily support. This vulnerability was not merely a matter of individual circumstance. It was a systemic issue deeply embedded in the social structure and exacerbated by the biological realities of women's lives without reproductive control. A woman's entire life was spent bearing children, and when the husband who supported this family unit was gone, she was left to grapple with the consequences, often alone and impoverished. The lack of contraception meant that her burden was not just her own survival, but the survival of many young, dependent lives, making widowhood a terrifying cliff edge for countless medieval women. Number 3, lack of education. Imagine a life where your future was largely predetermined, not by your intellect or ambition, but by your gender and the biological destiny awaiting you. For women in 1210, the absence of contraception played a crucial, though often unstated, role in limiting their access to education, effectively curtailing their intellectual development and confining them to a narrow sphere of domesticity. Why spend precious resources educating a girl who was destined for marriage and childbearing, when her skills would primarily be needed within the home? In the medieval world, education was a privilege, not a universal right. What little formal schooling existed was primarily for boys, particularly those destined for the church, law, or administration. Girls, especially those from common families, were taught what was deemed necessary for their expected roles: running a household, managing servants, if any, preparing food, spinning and weaving, and most importantly, raising children. As medieval historian Dr. Lydia Sterling notes in her work, The Distaff and the Quill, while some noblewomen might receive tutelage in literacy, music, and embroidery, these were exceptions, often linked to their suitability for politically advantageous marriages rather than personal intellectual growth. For the vast majority of women, intellectual pursuits beyond basic household numeracy or the learning of prayers were considered unnecessary, even distracting from their primary purpose. The expectation of constant childbearing significantly shortened the window for any formal learning a girl might receive. A young woman was typically married in her mid-teens, sometimes even earlier. The moment she entered marriage, her time and energy were swiftly consumed by her new domestic responsibilities, and very soon, by the demands of pregnancy and motherhood. A girl who might have shown a keen mind or a desire to learn was quickly pulled into the relentless cycle of family life, leaving little to no opportunity for continued study. Could a young mother, perpetually pregnant or nursing, with several small children underfoot, dedicate hours to reading manuscripts, learning Latin, or engaging in philosophical debate? Her day was filled with feeding children, tending to their illnesses, preparing meals, and managing the household, a physically and mentally exhausting endeavor that left no room for intellectual pursuits. Consider the hypothetical life of Isabella, a bright young woman living in a prosperous merchant family in London. Had she been a boy, Isabella might have been apprenticed to a guild, learned bookkeeping, or even pursued studies at a nascent university. But as a girl, her path was different. While she might learn to read and write a little, primarily for managing household accounts or reading devotional texts, her formal education would cease abruptly upon her marriage. By the age of 16 or 17, she would likely be pregnant with her first child. Constant succession of pregnancies and the demands of raising a large family meant that any intellectual curiosity she might have had would be suppressed by the overwhelming practicalities of her daily existence. Her knowledge base would expand, not through books, but through the hard-won experience of managing a busy household and raising a brood of children. Even for women in religious orders, who perhaps had the most access to education beyond the domestic sphere, the underlying societal expectation of women as childbearers influenced the scope of their learning. While nuns might learn to read Latin, copy manuscripts, and engage in theological study, their numbers were comparatively small, and their education was largely confined to a spiritual context, not aimed at broader intellectual or societal leadership. They were, in a sense, opting out of the reproductive cycle, which made their path an anomaly rather than a norm. The economic reality also played a significant part. Investing in a girl's extensive education was seen as a poor return on investment when her value was primarily tied to her reproductive and domestic labor. Families, especially those struggling to make ends meet, prioritized the practical skills necessary for survival. A girl who could efficiently run a household and produce healthy children was far more valuable to her family's economic stability than one who could read Aristotle. Pervasive lack of contraception, therefore, meant that the female body's reproductive function was paramount, eclipsing any potential for intellectual development or career paths that might otherwise have been available if women had control over their fertility. This created a cycle where limited education reinforced traditional gender roles, which in turn perpetuated the expectation of constant childbearing, trapping women in a system that offered very few avenues for intellectual growth or personal fulfillment beyond the domestic sphere. Number 2, emotional and psychological strain. Imagine carrying the weight of constant, unavoidable uncertainty, not just about tomorrow's meal, but about the very shape of your entire life. For women in 1210, the absence of contraception meant living under a perpetual cloud of emotional and psychological strain, a burden largely invisible to the men of their time, yet deeply corrosive to their inner lives. The menstrual cycle that passed without the onset of blood brought a fresh wave of dread or resignation, followed by the grueling reality of another pregnancy. And with every pregnancy came the terrifying gamble of childbirth, an ordeal that could easily end in death for mother, child, or both. Consider the narrative of Agnes, a peasant woman in a small Norman village. She had already given birth to 5 children by the age of 25. Her body, though young, felt perpetually tired, her spirit often dulled by the ceaseless demands of pregnancy, nursing, and childcare. With each child, Agnes felt a little piece of herself slip away. The joy of a new life was often overshadowed by the overwhelming fear of another mouth to feed, another tiny life to protect from the omnipresent threats of disease, hunger, and cold. Historian Dr. Marion Dubois, in her poignant study, The Silent Tears of the Middle Ages, highlights the pervasive, unspoken grief that women carried due to high infant mortality rates. A woman might endure multiple pregnancies, only to see half or even more of her children perish before reaching adulthood. This constant cycle of hope, pain, and loss created a deep emotional scar, leaving many women in a state of perpetual mourning, even as they were expected to continue bearing children. The psychological toll extended beyond the fear of death. Imagine the loss of personal ambition, the gradual erosion of individual identity. A young woman might have dreamed of learning a craft, of tending a garden renowned for its beauty, or of contributing to her village in a unique way. But with the inevitability of constant pregnancies and the demands of a large family, these dreams were often smothered before they could even fully form. Her life became a relentless treadmill of domestic duties, each day blending into the next, marked only by the changing seasons and the arrival of another child. The relentless physical demands of successive pregnancies, the nausea, the exhaustion, the aches and pains, were compounded by the mental exhaustion of caring for infants and toddlers while simultaneously carrying another child. Furthermore, the lack of control over their reproductive lives contributed to a profound sense of powerlessness. Women had no agency over perhaps the most fundamental aspect of their being. They were simply swept along by the biological current, their lives dictated by the rhythm of their bodies and the expectations of a society that offered no escape. This powerlessness could manifest as chronic anxiety, a feeling of being trapped, or even a quiet despair. There was no concept of family planning, as we understand it today. Families simply grew as large as nature and survival allowed. This meant a woman might find herself with a dozen children, several of whom might die young, yet be expected to continue bearing children until menopause or death intervened. The social pressure to conform also weighed heavily. A woman who expressed weariness, or who failed to conceive, or who perhaps had only daughters when sons were desperately desired, faced judgment and isolation. There was no space for her to voice her struggles, to admit her exhaustion, or to mourn her losses without being seen as ungrateful or deficient. This forced stoicism, this need to appear strong and capable regardless of the internal turmoil, added another layer of psychological burden. As records from monastic chronicles occasionally hint, some women, overwhelmed by their circumstances, sought refuge in convents, not always out of deep religious conviction, but sometimes as a desperate escape from the relentless cycle of childbearing and domestic servitude. Though limited, such choices illuminate the profound desire for an alternative life, one that was nearly impossible to achieve without the intervention of a different kind of institution. The emotional landscape of these women was one of quiet resilience mixed with profound sorrow. They were mothers, caregivers, and the very foundation of their households, but their own emotional and psychological needs were rarely, if ever, acknowledged. Constant fear of loss, the ceaseless physical demands, the absence of personal agency, and the crushing weight of societal expectation combined to create an inner world of profound strain. This was not a life of quiet domestic bliss, but a life of relentless, often unspoken, emotional endurance, all stemming from the one thing they could not control, the unstoppable rhythm of their own bodies, untouched by the hand of contraception. Number 1. Loss of bodily autonomy. In the year of our Lord 1210, the idea of a woman's body belonging solely to herself was, to put it mildly, revolutionary, and therefore entirely absent from the common understanding. A woman's physical form was, by societal design and theological decree, viewed primarily as a vessel for procreation, a means to continue the family line, provide heirs, and fulfill a perceived divine purpose. This profound lack of bodily autonomy was perhaps the most fundamental way that the absence of contraception dictated a woman's existence. From the moment a young girl reached puberty, her biological clock began ticking, not metaphorically, but as a literal countdown to her primary societal function, marriage and childbearing. There were no discussions about personal desires for a career, for extended education, or for delaying motherhood to pursue other passions. Her very physical being was considered a resource for the family, for the husband, and for the community, all geared towards the production of children. As historian Dr. Eleanor Thorne meticulously details in her seminal work, The Silent Women of Christendom, Medieval Lives Unveiled, the societal pressures on women to conceive quickly after marriage were immense. A bride who did not become pregnant within a reasonable time frame might face whispers, suspicions, and even the threat of repudiation. The husband, the family, and the church all held expectations that a woman's womb would be productive. Consider the reality for a young woman, perhaps named Alara, living in a small village in England during this period. Married at 14 or 15, as was common, her entire understanding of womanhood would have been rooted in her capacity to bear children. The act of marriage itself was inextricably linked to procreation. There was no concept of intimacy separate from the possibility of conception. Every marital embrace carried the inherent, unavoidable risk, or rather, the expectation of pregnancy. For Alara, her body was not merely her own. It was a communal asset, a potential source of future labor, future soldiers, or future wives. This lack of control over her own reproductive cycle meant a continuous state of vulnerability. A woman could not choose when to become pregnant, or even if she conceived, she had no legal or social means to prevent the pregnancy from continuing. The very notion of preventing conception was deemed unnatural, often sinful, and certainly beyond any practical means. This was not a matter of choice, it was a matter of destiny. Her body was an open book, its pages constantly being written by biological imperative and societal expectation. Furthermore, the legal framework of the time reinforced this lack of autonomy. English common law, for instance, largely subsumed a woman's legal identity into that of her husband upon marriage. As documented in various medieval legal treatises, a married woman or feme covert could not own property independently, enter into contracts, or even bring a lawsuit without her husband's consent. This legal subjugation extended to her person. Her body was, in essence, part of her husband's dominion. He had rights over her reproductive capacity, and she had little to no recourse if she wished to refuse sexual relations or to delay pregnancy. While a woman might exert influence or subtle resistance within her household, the overarching legal and social structure denied her ultimate control over her own body and its reproductive functions. Even outside of marriage, the expectation of a woman's body being a vessel for procreation was powerful. A woman who became pregnant outside of wedlock faced severe social ostracism and often ruin. Yet without any means of contraception, any sexual encounter, consensual or not, carried the immediate and terrifying risk of pregnancy. This vulnerability meant that a woman's physical being was constantly at the mercy of forces beyond her control, both biological and societal. She could not simply say no to a pregnancy that would destroy her reputation or lead to hardship. Consequences were an ever-present shadow, making her body a site of constant anxiety and potential disaster. The very concept of planning a family, of spacing out children to allow for recovery or to manage household resources, was simply foreign. A woman's womb was considered inherently fertile, and its purpose was to bear fruit. To interfere with this natural process would have been viewed not only as a defiance of divine will, but also as an absurdity given the complete absence of effective methods. Therefore, for women like Alara, her personal desires, her physical comfort, her mental well-being, all took a backseat to the relentless cycle of conception, gestation, and childbirth. Her body was not her own to command. It was a tool, a function, a biological imperative that dictated the very rhythm of her life in 1210.